A fundamental decision that has to be taken concerns the purpose of the strategy that an organization has to follow. For example, in September 2008, Lehman Brothers, which was then the fourth largest investment bank in the US, collapsed. It was the biggest banking collapse in history. And the view of the media was that this failure was avoidable. In their view, the central problem or the main issue was not only a flawed strategy, but the failure of the Lehman board of directors to be more responsible and proactive in monitoring and constraining the CEO at the time, Dick Fulg's, reckless pursuit of the strategy. It was a failure of both strategy and governance. This case also showed us the importance of being clear about what purpose drives the strategy of organizations. So who influences such a purpose and who monitors performance against purpose? These are the central concerns of this topic. An important concept here is that of stakeholders, who are those individuals or groups that depend on an organization to fulfill their own goals and on whom in turn the organization depends. An underlying question is whether the strategic purpose of the organization should be determined in response to the expectations of a particular stakeholder, for example, shareholders, or should it really depend on broader stakeholder interests? So at the extreme, society, social good, and the environment. Who is it ultimately that businesses need to be accountable to, and what is their purpose based on? Therefore, the key topic intended learning outcomes for this particular topic are firstly to identify and explain the components of the governance chain of an organization, explain the concept of an organizational stakeholder and the stakeholder view of the firm, and finally, to get you to undertake stakeholder analysis as a means of identifying the influence of different stakeholder groups in terms of their power and interest. So based on your prescribed reading for this particular topic, these are the three areas of consideration. Firstly, if you look at corporate governance and the regulatory framework within which organizations operate, the concern here is the way in which investors or boards influence strategic purpose through these formalized processes of supervising executive decisions and actions. In turn, this then raises questions of accountability. Who are strategists accountable to? There are significant differences in the approach to corporate governance internationally, broadly relating to whether they take a shareholder view or a stakeholder view, which are discussed in the topic. The other issue here is around social responsibility and ethics. The question here is which purpose an organization should fulfill. So how should managers respond to the expectations society has of their organizations, both in terms of social responsibility and also in terms of the behavior of the individuals within the organizations. And then finally, it's important to understand different stakeholder expectations and their relative influence on strategic purpose. So this requires an understanding of both the power and interest of different stakeholder groups, which is addressed through stakeholder analysis. Now, for the purposes of this topic, we'll be focusing on the governance structure and stakeholder expectations. And the reason why social responsibility and ethics haven't been included in this particular topic, it's not that it isn't important, it's that the rest of the subject focuses quite heavily, and by now you have a good understanding of what a business's social responsibility and sustainability responsibility are from an environmental, social, and an economic perspective. So let's kick things off with the first topic, ILO, the governance chain. And to do that, of course, let's look at what the definition of corporate governance is. It's concerned with the structures and systems of control by which managers are held accountable to those who have a legitimate stake in an organization. Corporate governance is increasingly important for organizations for three main reasons. Firstly, it has to do with the separation of ownership and management control of organizations, which is actually the norm, except for very small businesses. So what that means is when you have large publicly listed companies, very often the owners are, for example, the shareholders, but yet the managers do not necessarily always own the company. So the question then becomes, if you have that separation between ownership and control, how do you ensure that those interests are aligned? So in other words, that the people that are managing the business, let's say you're a shareholder, how do you know that they'll be managing it in a way that maximizes your interests and not only theirs? The second reason corporate governance is really important is because of the large number of corporate scandals we've seen since the late 1990s. And this has really increased the public debate about how different parties in governance structures should interact and influence each other. And the most notable one here is the relationship between shareholders or the owners of the firm and the boards of businesses. But also in the public sector, it's the relationship between government or public funding bodies and public sector organizations. So it isn't only, corporate governance isn't only an issue that relates to the private sector, it does extend to the public sector as well. And then the third reason, and that's very relevant to the subject, is the increased accountability to wider stakeholder interests, particularly the argument that businesses need to be more visibly accountable and or responsive, not only to the owners and the managers in the governance chain, but also to a wider social interest. So this governance chain here shows the roles and relationships of different groups involved in the governance of an organization. In a small family business, the governance chain is quite simple. There are family shareholders or family owners of the business. There's a board with some family members. There are managers, some of them who might be family too. In that case, there'd only be 3 layers in the chain. But this particular figure shows a governance chain for a typically large, publicly listed organization. Here, the size of the organization means there are all these extra layers of management internally, while being publicly listed introduces more investor layers as well. So the relationships in such a governance chain can be understood in terms of the principal-agent model or agency theory, which I referred to a bit earlier. So what that means is the primary purpose of having these layers is to try and ensure that the interests of the principal, who is the shareholders or the owner, aligns with the interest of the agent, who is often the management of the business. Because when a business goes public, as I said, you get that divide between the owners and the managers. And so corporate governance introduces these layers to make sure that those interests are aligned. So to go into detail with some of the issues that are highlighted by the governance chain, the first question is, who are executives responsible to? And so are those executives responsible only to shareholders or to a wider range of stakeholders? And in different parts of the world, this varies. In some parts of the world, like the US or the UK, for example, they follow what's called a shareholder model. And then in countries like Germany and Japan, they follow more of a stakeholder model, which is, in other words, they are accountable to a much wider group of stakeholders. The second question is, who are the actual shareholders? So what does this mean in terms of the governance chain? So the final beneficiaries, so the people that receive a dividend at the end of every financial year, are very far removed from the managers. So for them, for many managers, then that idea of responsibilities can become quite notional. So in practical terms, directors of a firm are more likely to engage with those that they most frequently interact with. So, you have these layers. So you have institutional representatives, investment managers. So that problem sort of compounds the issue if you don't know who you're ultimately responsible to and who the final beneficiaries are. The next question becomes, what is the role of institutional investors? So institutional investors are really large investors who own a significant shareholding in a particular organization. So think of a large pension or superannuation fund that owns a big stake in the business. So the question then is, how actively do they seek to influence your strategy? So in countries like the UK or USA, investors have exerted their influence simply through buying and selling of shares, rather than through in-depth engagement with the company on strategic issues. So the stock market, in that case, is the judge of the action through share price movements. But we are seeing more and more that these influential institutional investors are becoming more actively involved in the strategies of the firms they invest. And there is evidence that institutional investors seek to work proactively with boards to develop strategy, and they do better for beneficiaries than those who don't. So again, going back to the example of a superannuation or pension fund with a significant holding in a business, they can, because of the amount of power they have, they're able to influence that particular organization's strategy. And then the final question becomes, what means of scrutiny and control exist within the governance chain? Obviously, given the scandals that we've just spoken about, these concerns about governance have grown in the last decade. There have been increasing attempts to build means of scrutinizing and controlling the activities of managers or agents in this chain to protect the interests of the final shareholders. This slide summarizes the benefits and disadvantages of governance based on a shareholder primacy model or a stakeholder model of a firm. Now, I won't go into detail into all the elements of this slide because they are explained very clearly in your prescribed reading. But the main thing to note here is the two fundamentally different approaches. In the shareholder model of governance, it's the actual shareholders that have the legitimate primacy in relation to the wealth generated by the businesses. So people who are pro the shareholder model argue that if you want to maximize shareholder value, that in turn benefits other stakeholders too. So very similar to the Milton Friedman argument that if a business actually focuses on maximizing its profit, other stakeholders and society will benefit as well. An alternative model of governance is that of the stakeholder model. This is founded on the principle that wealth is created, captured, and distributed by a variety of stakeholders. So it's saying that the value isn't only created in monetary terms, and not only created by shareholders. So this model does include shareholders, but it does include other investors too, such as banks, employees, or their union representatives. And so management then needs to be responsible and responsive to multiple stakeholders who also may be represented on boards. So the stakeholder model is also sometimes called the blockholder model of governance. So where one or two large group of investors come to dominate ownership. For example, in Germany, just less than 3/4 of all German listed companies have a majority owner. In addition, in countries like Germany and Sweden, banks play a dominant role, and Japanese banks also tend to have shareholdings in organizations. as against simply just providing loan capital. So having unions or banks and other large stakeholder groups on your board and sometimes even in your management forces businesses to make decisions that are aligned with those stakeholder interests, not only shareholders. Okay, so at the end of this topic, ILO, the review and reflect is just a reading. It's an article from S&P Global. And if you recall, you were introduced to the concept of ESG in an earlier lecture, so environmental, social, and governance measurements. And so this article summarizes the role of G within the context of ESG. We now turn our attention to the second topic, ILO, which is on stakeholders. Stakeholders are defined as those individuals or groups who depend on an organization to fulfill their own goals and on whom in turn the organization depends. Now, stakeholders pose a challenge because there are likely to be many stakeholders, particularly if you're thinking about a large organization, as I'll show you in just a second. And very often these stakeholders can perhaps have conflicting expectations. And so managers therefore need to take a view on which stakeholders will have the greatest influence, therefore which expectations they need to pay the most attention to, and to what extent the expectations and influence of different stakeholders vary. So as I mentioned, if you look at stakeholders in a large organization, they can be many, they can go into the hundreds. I mean, this diagram doesn't even capture all of them. But typically, you can think of stakeholders in two ways, those being external to the organization and those being internal. So external stakeholders can be made up of economic stakeholders, so including suppliers, competitors, distributors. You can have socio-political stakeholders such as policymakers, government, regulators, those kinds of stakeholders. And then you can have technological stakeholders as external ones as well. So, standards agencies, owners of competitive technology, and others that influence the diffusion of new technology and the adoption of industry standards. You also have internal stakeholder groups, which include obviously your employees, but they can be broken down according to departments, geographical locations, or different levels in the organizational hierarchy. So since the expectations of all these different stakeholder groups will vary and differ over time, it's normal for conflict to exist regarding the importance or desirability of many aspects of strategy. And in most situations, a compromise will need to be reached. The best way to summarize stakeholder theory is to go to the source. So, watch a video from Edward Freeman, who is credited with developing stakeholder theory. And in this video, he explains the primary ideas behind stakeholder theory and how having a stakeholder orientation creates value for organizations. For the final ILO, once you know who your stakeholders are, it's important to classify them in a meaningful way that allows organizations to decide how many resources to allocate to each of the stakeholders and how to communicate with them and how to manage them. Resources can be in the form of time, effort, money, and any other means by which the stakeholders' needs can be met. A useful first step is stakeholder mapping, and this identifies stakeholder expectations and power and helps in understanding political priorities. There are different ways in which stakeholder mapping can be used to gain an understanding of stakeholder influence. The approach that we use in this particular topic to stakeholder mapping identifies stakeholder expectations and power and helps in understanding those political priorities. And it underlines the importance of two key issues. Firstly, how interested each stakeholder group is in impressing its expectations on the organization's purpose and choice of strategies. And secondly, whether the stakeholders have the power to do so. The power interest matrix, which is presented in your prescribed readings, is our chosen approach to mapping stakeholders in this particular topic. And based on the level of interest and power that stakeholders have, they fall into one of four categories. A, minimal effort, B, keep informed, C, keep satisfied, and D are the key players. So starting with key players, this category is where you have high power and high interest stakeholders. These are the most important stakeholders. And you can plan to stay in regular communication with them to ensure their satisfaction with whatever it is the business plans to do and keep them informed of progress at all times. The second category, which is keep satisfied, this is for the high power and low interest stakeholders. These stakeholders are important, but they don't need to be communicated to as often and closely as key players. The third category is keep informed, and this is for the low power and high interest stakeholders. These stakeholders may have advice and guidance for a particular project, as well as advance notice of any emerging issues. So it's important to stay in occasional contact with them. The final category, which is minimal effort, this is for low power and low interest stakeholders. These stakeholders are the lowest priority, and the aim here is to keep in touch with them, but organizations don't need to spend as much time communicating with them as they do with other stakeholders. So once you have your mapping, it helps to answer these key questions. Firstly, when you're determining the purpose of your business and your strategy, which stakeholder expectations need to be most considered? Secondly, do the actual levels of interest and power reflect the corporate governance framework? So that becomes really important because your corporate governance framework ultimately will be reflected somehow in how your stakeholders are communicated with and how they're responded to and managed. The other key question that this helps you answer is, who are the key blockers and facilitators of the strategy? So if you have key players that are both very powerful and are very interested, they can go one of two ways. They could either help to facilitate a particular strategy. So in other words, if they're on your side, but the other thing could be true where they are not happy at all with a particular strategy and therefore can block the progress of your business. The next question that you can ask is it desirable to reposition certain stakeholders? So you might have a case where a stakeholder, for example, a particular customer group is currently, requires very minimal effort. But over time, if factors in your external environment change, they might suddenly move into one of the other categories. So you can, again, depending on the decision about how many resources you want to extend and expend on a particular stakeholder group, you might choose to reposition them into one of the other quadrants, or they might actually move to one of the quadrants as the environment changes. And then finally, can the level of interest or power of key stakeholders be maintained? Now that becomes an important question when you think about stakeholders that are particularly powerful for organizations. Is it something that will continue to be the case in the future, or is there a case to reposition those stakeholders again as well? One of the central features in the model, in the matrix, is that of power. Now, we define power as the ability of individuals or groups to persuade, induce, or coerce others into following certain courses of action. Now, you can have sources of power within organizations or externally as well. So those sources of power with internal stakeholders we'll consider first, and then we'll consider sources of power with external stakeholders. So when you think of, say, employees within an organization, their power can be sourced from a number of different areas. It could be based on the organizational hierarchy. So the higher up in the organizational chain certain employees are, they might have more power accordingly. You might have control of strategic resources within organizations as well. So, for example, if there are key products that your company produces, the groups that manage those products could have disproportionately more power than others within the organization. You also have control of human resources. So there's certain employees within the organization who might have superior skills. You know, if you're a very technology dependent company, there might be sort of technological skills that are a source of power. You might have brilliant negotiators within your business who are a source of power as well. Then linked to that is the idea of knowledge possession. So in addition to certain human resources, there might be certain individuals or groups within the organization who have power based on the amount of knowledge they have about the business, about certain external stakeholders. They might have influence outside of the business as well. So really there are a number of sources of power within internal stakeholders of the organization. When we consider external stakeholders, there are also key sources of power, starting with control of strategic resources. So if you have stakeholders that are key input into your business, you know, certain suppliers, you know, unions, if there's certain stakeholders that you rely on for money, you know, banks, etc., that is obviously a key source of power. Then when we talk about involvement from an external stakeholder perspective, that relates to their involvement in your ability to run your business and in the implementation of your strategy. So for example, you know, certain distribution channels, agents, you know, if you're in an insurance business, you might have brokers and agents who sell your products. They could be significantly involved and also have significant power. And then you have informal links to internal power. So it's well known that there are key players outside the organization based on their relationships, say, with management, etc. They have the ability to influence decision making and strategy. And so you need to keep them on side. And then similarly to internal stakeholders, you have particularly external stakeholders who have set of knowledge or skills, and in the increasingly sort of ecosystem partnered world that businesses operate in, you know, a lot of, particularly say in the IT sector, a lot of the strategic partners that businesses work with, you know, that software providers, for example, or data providers, they have a lot of knowledge. And so that dependency on that stakeholder group is particularly high as well. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this topic ILO on stakeholder mapping. For the review and reflect, it's one thing, I guess, to talk about what stakeholder mapping is, but quite a different thing to do it. And so I'd like you to watch a video of someone who actually undertakes stakeholder mapping in a particular scenario so you could learn how to do it yourself. So that brings us to the end of this week's topic. In preparation for the next topic, make sure you review this week's materials, prepare for the next topic, which is on government, policy and politics. Make sure you also read and watch any prescribed materials for next week, and prepare for or complete any assessments that are either due or coming up shortly.